Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger. Welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp LaRouche. It's August 27th, 2020. Now, as many of you are probably realizing, the dog days of August are oftentimes where people think there's not much going on, but actually this is the period when wars often start, when people are not paying attention. There are a number of things going on that deserve attention, but the most important is that we're going to be having a conference September 5th and September 6th. And Helga, I think that's a good place to start because people need to get away from the media, get away from the fake news, and actually get into a situation where they can think critically about what's going to be going on in the future and what they need to do. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the upcoming conference?
Well, this conference will try to elevate the discussion on a different plane, because if you look at all the different crises which are accumulating and expanding, you have a pandemic, you have an economic collapse, you have an extremely dangerous escalation of the confrontation between the US and China, but also really with Russia. There is a danger that this all will go completely out of control. And the purpose of this conference, which will be an effort to establish a new paradigm, to discuss the need to have a completely new economic system, a credit system, a new Bretton Woods system, to re-establish the idea of worldwide economic development with the World Land Bridge, to establish the idea of a world health system, to have a dialogue of civilizations, and actually a basis for how the world and how the different nations of the world can actually work together and have a future of peace and not of war. So this is designed to be a very important intervention to also inspire some of the discussions at the UN General Assembly, but especially to also focus on the P5 summit, which has been called for by President Putin, of the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council. And we will have an extremely exciting program. We have top-notch speakers from actually all over the world. So I would really urge you that you should absolutely find the time to be part of this conference. If you register, you can have live translation if you're not an English speaker into many languages, and also participate in the form of Q&A. So reserve that date, 5th and 6th of September. It is going to be the most important event, at least of this period.
And this will be an online conference, and you can register at the schillerinstitute.com, which is the sponsor of the conference. Now, you said, Helga, this will be an exciting conference. Well, we've seen these conventions unfolding. The Democratic Convention was a real snooze fest. And mostly what we learned from the Democratic Convention is that most Democrats hate Donald Trump. The Republican Convention has had some interesting developments, both in terms of what's been said there and the reaction to it. What's your impression from what you've seen so far?
Well, I had not the time to follow everything, but I, naturally kept an eye on the good things and bad things which happened. The bad thing to start off with, that was this unbelievable bellicose speech which was made by Pompeo from Jerusalem, where he had nothing better to do than to attack the aggressive policies of the Communist Party of China, spreading death. I mean, the language was just so provocative. So he should not have done that, because, as some experts were noting, this was in all likelihood a violation of the Hedge Act, which should prohibit members of an administration to intervene in partisan politics. So, this was bad. I think Rand Paul, on the other side, was in stark contrast to that, by pointing out that, the Trump administration is the first one since the Reagan administration which did not start a new war. And, that Trump actually has been trying to implement his policy of ending the endless wars. So I think there were these two poles. I think the Democrats in their comments about this convention, really show that somehow they have lost it. Hillary Clinton for sure lost it after she lost the election in 2016, and she can't somehow overcome it. She gave the advice to Biden to under no circumstances concede the election, um, until the last vote is counted. All this idea that there will be a turmoil around the ballots, the absentee ballots, that Trump will refuse to leave the White House even if he loses the election. You had this whole discussion by these two colonels that the military should remove him, which was then denied by the Pentagon. But you have all the preparations going in the direction of having a big constitutional crisis come election day, and the Democrats are clearly playing that game. And then Pelosi having this unbelievable language saying the enemy of the country is living in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and the Congress. I mean, these Democrats are really, I think they have lost it. I mean, they are the war party. They are they are relentless in their attempts to get Trump out of the White House one way or another. And I think Melania made a quite interesting speech, which she got a lot of appreciation for, except from the London Guardian, who naturally cannot say anything positive about the Trumps. So I think this should really now be over. Trump is the candidate, and I think it's now time to go in the direction of solutions and not get stuck in party politics.
I think one of the most notable facts was that the Democrats continue to use this line of Russia intervened, Trump is owned by Putin, the Russians are going to intervene again. This is nonstop from them. But one of the things that did come out, you mentioned the Rand Paul statement against the endless wars. It's clear that Biden intends to continue these wars. But I think the other thing that was discussed to some extent at the Republican convention, which could point toward why the Republicans should pay attention to what we're going to discuss at our conference, is they brought up trade policy, the need to continue moving away from these global free trade agreements, growth as opposed to the Green New Deal, the anti-growth policies of the Democratic Party, and then, of course, the ending of the wars. Now, one of the problems on the ending of the wars is you have Pompeo, who, as you pointed out, is clearly aligning himself with Biden and the war party as a whole. The military confrontations in the Gulf of Bohai. What's the latest going on there, Helga?
Well, this confrontation policy by the U.S. military in the Pacific, in the South China Sea, in the north of China, I think this is reaching really a very dangerous dimension where you could have another U2 moment. There was actually an incident where a U.S. A plane flew into the no-fly zone where the PLA in the north of China had a drill with live ammunition, and this was a clear provocation, a violation of the air space. The Chinese reacted practically immediately by sending two missiles from two different locations to the South China Sea, where in the recent period the presence of both U.S. Military planes and also military vessels, U.S. military vessels, was increasing, and there is an absolute escalation where these incidents are so dangerous. All you have to have is a mistake, a misunderstanding, a misreading, or even a design provocation, and you could actually set off a war. I mean, that is an absolute immediate possibility. And then you can see also that the faction in the United States who actually wants to decouple from China economically, they are fully on their way. the US put out now a list of 24 Chinese firms which are involved in different aspects of construction in these artificial islands in the South China Sea region. And they are just putting sanctions on them, meaning that any firm which cooperates with them will be hit by these economic effects. So this is clearly directed against the Belt and Road Initiative. And, I think there is no way how that can end well, because the US and the Chinese economies are so dependent on each other or intermingled that any kind of effort to cut this off is really a bellicose act and should really not be. The US and China absolutely have to cooperate on all fields, especially fighting the pandemic, developing vaccines, distributing them all over the world. This is an absolute terrible cause, which, anybody who has any sense where history is, and you mentioned the month of August, I hope this is not the guns of August leading to World War III, because that is, a not to be excluded possibility. And, even seasoned people like John Nye is warning that this could lead to nuclear war. So that is now not the first one who is mentioning that. We had a whole bunch of other people, Kevin Rudd, Scott Morrison, other commentators, and you don't really need to you need to know anything about how these conflicts erupt. It could be another 2014 where a little incident triggers a chessboard which has been prepared for a very long time, leading to the unthinkable. So this is a course which absolutely must be reversed if the world is supposed to survive.
And you mentioned the sanction policy against China, which is aimed at the Belt and Road Initiative. Also on sanctions, we have the stunt pulled by Secretary of State Pompeo, demanding that the UN Security Council snap back to sanctions against Iran. This was rejected by virtually everyone on the UN Security Council, but Pompeo, as the imperialist that he is, said it doesn't matter, we're going to go alone. What signal does this send to the world when you have this kind of bullying going on by a US official?
Well, I think, you have practically two different worlds. You have the West, which right now is going into a turbulent period because the same kind of sanctions which are supposed to hit Iran, the US is now threatening against Germany, a supposed ally, and people in Germany get really upset. It's because of this Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and people are really getting very upset. I mean, this can have all kinds of consequences for the long-term durability of the alliance. You can't do that without causing really people to rethink their interest. Then you have this incredible effort by the US again to stop the highway being built eventually from Panama, Costa Rica to Mexico. And there's a threat now to put sanctions on all the firms which cooperate with that highway, trying to get Costa Rica to basically abandon it. Now that's the Belt and Road Initiative. That's the chance of developing countries to participate for the first time in infrastructure to overcome their underdevelopment. And I think that this is dangerous, but it's also not going to help the United States to win friends. The opposite will be the case. So on this snapback election, I mean, that's just incredible, because I mean, everybody agrees that this JCPOA treaty with Iran was useful, productive. It did get Iran to stop its nuclear weapons program. The International Atomic Energy Agency is just in Iran. They just inspected all the relevant sites. they have found no indication that that Iran was not complying. So everybody agrees that this was a very important treaty, and everybody wants to keep it. Now, Pompeo, after being defeated in the UN vote, wrote this letter. And now basically you have a situation where Russia, China, but also Germany, Great Britain, France, and 8 other countries all say they disagree with the US position. Now, Pompeo for sure will not back down unless he's told by Trump. But he is planning to go ahead with it. And since Pompeo announced this deadline of 30 days on the 20th of August, if you project that 30 days, you get into the second half of September, which is exactly when the UN General Assembly starts to work in earnest. I think they start on the 15th of September. And then, the heads of state come and give speeches, virtual or otherwise. But, this is clearly designed to create a major crisis in the middle of this process and, ruin the chances of this P5 summit, which is being promoted by Putin and which is so urgently necessary that President Trump, President Xi, and President Putin, that they all meet, and then Macron and Boris Johnson, but especially these 3 presidents, they have to get over this confrontation, geopolitical, nightmare which we see playing out right now. So, I can not predict what will happen, but, you cannot sanction the whole world without causing reactions, by all of these countries. So this is a no-win policy unless you are trying to create chaos and havoc for some ulterior motive, and that's what it really looks like what Pompeo is up to.
On the Iran sanction question, you remember the former British ambassador to Washington pointed out that a possible war between the U.S. and Iran may be one of the ways they could end up getting rid of Trump. And this is, of course, one of the goals of these people planning these British imperial geopolitical operations. I want to come back to one thing on the sanctions question against China and the decoupling question. Is it possible that people like Wilbur Ross and Navarro and the people pushing this hard line against China are unaware of the damage to the U.S. economy if there is a decoupling with China?
Well, it puts into question their economic understanding for sure, because many of the companies which are hit by the sanctions are really American companies, and the U.S. Buyer will have to pay the price. Now, I think that the idea to go back to 2 blocks is just not going to work, because it will not work to the advantage of the West, of the US and Europe, because if you look at the figures right now, the only country which managed to have a growth rate is China in the first half of this year. The Great Britain had a collapse of the GDP by 20%, France almost 14%, Germany about 10%, the US about 10%, but China had a growth rate, I think, of 3%, but it's a growth rate. It's not what it used to be, but I think it's very clear, that they have managed to deal with all of this much better. But, this is really going backwards in history. We should look forward and have a policy of solving the many problems, including world hunger, together. The World Food Programme just put out a report that they had issued a couple of weeks ago, an urgent warning that in order to deal with the famine, which is in part escalated by the pandemic, they would need $5 billion, which $5 billion is a lot of money. But if you think about the trillions which were pumped into the system by the central bank since last September, 5 billion is really almost peanuts. And what did the World Food Programme get? 750 million. and they just issued an urgent call that they need urgently $4 billion, or otherwise a lot of people will die of hunger. So, we have these real problems, and I think we should all lose patience with these geopolitical games, because it goes to the detriment of a lot of people who lose their life as a result of it.
One of those geopolitical games is almost so predictable that as we're moving toward the possibility of a P5 summit, we have another so-called Russian poisoning, the so-called Navalny case. What do you make of this, Helga?
Well, this is almost a classical case, I mean, it's the same script like the Skripals and all the other people who were supposedly murdered by Putin. Actually, I mean, there is no proof. The Navalny, who is a known, he always gets characterized as the big critic of the Kremlin, but really he is a relatively unimportant right-wing populist nationalist. He's not exactly somebody who has any standing in Russia whatsoever, but he's being played again and again by the Western media as the big opponent of Putin. So he had some kind of a trouble flying from Tomsk in Siberia on the road to Moscow. He fell unconscious. They had to divert the plane to Omsk. Then, he went to the hospital there. And then there was this big story that he was poisoned. Eventually, a plane was organized from Germany with a medical team. They flew him into the Charité clinic in Berlin, where he's being treated now. Now, the doctors just said that they found a substance in his blood which could be poisoning, but it's a substance which is also caused, or rather belonging to certain medications which you have to take for diabetes and all kinds of other things. So the statement by the Charité is actually, not totally affirmative that it was poisoning at all, but naturally all the media go with it. Now there are a couple of questions, which should be asked. Now, I mean, who is paying for all of this? Because to have a chartered medical plane and a whole team of doctors on standby for quite some time cost a little fortune. So that question of who is organizing that, because this is all part of the creating an environment where you can keep the confrontation, the demonization against Russia, against China. And I hate to tell you, this is all a preparation for World War III if it's not being stopped.
Now, finally, in terms of some of the political situations, we have the outbreak of riots in Kenosha, Wisconsin, following a shooting of an African-American man by police. It appears as though a major part of the Democratic program is to paint Trump as a racist and unleash chaos in the American cities. But they never talk about the other part of this, which is you have the unemployment, the poverty. How would you address this question of so-called social justice?
Well, in a certain sense, like you have two different worlds. One is the Chinese world, which has a 5,000-year-old culture, and they have a completely different tradition. They have been for 1,000 years the leading country in the world, the largest GDP until the 17th century. Then they fell back. Now they're coming back. People know nothing about that. The people who are so anti-China and anti-Communist Party of China, they know nothing about the history, the tradition of Confucius. And I think it's extremely urgent that the people in the West start to develop an understanding what this other world is like. Now, the reason why I'm saying that is because in the United States, you almost have a similar situation with the two worlds, where one world knows that it's two worlds and the other world does not even acknowledge that the second world exists. What I'm talking about is the black people, or the people from different minorities, but especially Afro-Americans, people who live in quite severe poverty. You have actually third world pockets in Alabama, in Mississippi. There are parts of the United States which really are not not part of the industrialized world. I mean, I have been in some of these rural areas, and I have seen how people live there, you know. And you have certain white people who pretend this all does not exist. And naturally, you know, when you then have this incidents or murders, you have an eruption of all of that, and that is being played then, you know, by the people who want to use the race riots in this campaign against Trump. But to not acknowledge that these two worlds do exist and that you urgently need an industrialization program, you know, for the cities. You have to reorganize the cities, rebuild the cities, but you also have to bring development to those pockets of third world like conditions in parts of the South in particular. So, you know, we can only hope that, you know, our program, which is what my late husband had designed, the 4 laws. You have to stop the speculation and the casinos with Glass-Steagall. You have to have banking separation. You have to go back to a Hamiltonian national bank. And you know, then you have to issue long-term low-interest credit for investment. The United States needs urgently investment in infrastructure. You know, fast train system is urgently needed to connect all major cities, to bring real development in the not developed areas, you know, and have the people who are now sort of the forgotten men participate in that. I think if President Trump would use his election campaign, you know, obviously he cannot get it really done now because the Democrats would sabotage everything what he proposes. But if he would now announce a real industrialization program, you know, for the time after the election, or find some way of, you know, moving this into the public eye, I think that that could cool down the situation if it is combined, you know, with something which gives people hope that they can overcome their situation of poverty. So I think, you know, what is needed is really, you know, the LaRouche program for the United States. We want to create 50 million productive jobs. I mean, that is what really would calm down the race riots. And I think that the willingness is there. I mean, there are enough people who would cooperate with President Trump for a real program, especially if it would be a worldwide program, including bringing development into Africa, into Latin America, but also, you know, especially the United States. So what we are trying to do is to discuss these ideas. This will be also a big part of the September conference of the Schiller Institute, how to reindustrialize the United States, how to overcome this terrible underdevelopment in many developing countries who shouldn't be called developing countries because they are not developing. They are indeed having an incredible crisis right now. So we have to bring together an alliance of forces worldwide and say what we need is a new just world economic order which allows the surviving of every human being and every nation on this planet. And if you agree with that approach, you should come to this conference, become a member of the Schiller Institute, and get active with us, because this is a period in which, you know, the decision of war and peace, of having a future of humanity or self-annihilation, that decision is upon us.
I would strongly recommend to all of our viewers that you not just register for yourself, but get your friends, get other people, go out and organize others to join this, because there's no one else that's actually raising these questions on the level that's necessary. And this is what is needed now. People have to become bigger, enlarge their hearts and their minds to take on this crisis. So Helga, I guess that's what we have for this week, and we'll see you again next week.
Yes, till next week.